Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's HSA Kilkenny Event 2 conference call. For your information, this call is being recorded. At this time, I would like to turn the call over to your host today, Marco Valentini. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Sophie. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marco Valentini, and I'm the Inspector within the Chemicals Policy and Services Division of the Health and Safety Authority. I'm also a member of the CLP Helpdesk, and I will be your moderator for today's event. First of all, I just wanted to display these instructions again for those attendees that are able to see the slide but haven't been able to connect to the teleconference yet. Based on feedback from last week's event and the expression of interest for this one, we have expanded the global reach for the teleconference, providing you with local access to the live teleconference. We hope you are finding this useful and that this will ensure good audio quality throughout the event. From this slide, you can also clearly see that our audience today is very broad. It is valid not only in terms of location, but also in terms of numbers, as we nearly reached the full capacity of 200 attendees for this event. On behalf of the CLP Helpdesk team, I would like to formally welcome you to this second HSA webinar. We are hoping that this will become a regular communication tool for ourselves to inform industry on a variety of topics. And considering the current weather conditions in Ireland, I am sure we all agree that this method has real benefits. In fact, as the whole country is snowed in and roads are blocked, we are all connecting from different locations in Ireland. Therefore, your understanding is very much appreciated if there will be some delays during the handover. Before we start with the presentations, there are a few housekeeping issues I'd like to mention to ensure the webinar runs smoothly. You have been muted on entry to the webinar, therefore you can't ask us questions over the phone. However, you will find a dedicated Q&A box on the bottom right-hand corner of the webinar console, and you're more than welcome to submit your questions using this box. Please note that the Q&A box should be used only for questions related to the presentations. When in full screen mode, you will be able to open the Q&A box by clicking on the question mark icon. If, on the contrary, you experience some technical difficulties, whether with audio or video, please use the chat box that is above the Q&A box. This will ensure your message is picked up immediately by a technician and dealt with accordingly. Finally, I would like to remind you to please switch off mobile phones and to close any other applications on your computer, as these can affect the quality of your streaming. Moving on to today's webinar team, I have already introduced myself as your moderator. I will shortly hand over to Karen Walsh for the first presentation. Karen has been working with the authority for 9 years, and she's what you can call our CLP guru. Not only she manages the national CLP Helpdesk, but she's also representing Ireland at the United Nations Subcommittee of Experts on GHS since 2005. And she was the Irish delegate at the CLP negotiations in 2007-2008. She's also currently involved in the expert working group drafting the Labelling and Packaging Guidance by ECHA. Our second speaker for today is Sinead McNicken. Sinead has been working for the authority for the past 8 years. Recently, she has been involved in the drafting of both the revision of Annex 2 to REACH regarding safe data sheets and the draft guidance for compiling safety data sheets. Sinead is currently working in the enforcement policy area of the authority and provides training and guidance to the compliance inspectors on both REACH and CLP. With that said, today's webinar will focus on your hazard communications obligations. It will highlight the main changes to the hazard label under CLP and the new SDS format and requirements introduced by REACH. The webinar will last approximately 75 minutes, and if time allows, we will have a Q&A session at the end of the event. If this won't be possible, we will answer your questions by reverting to you directly via email early next week. I will now hand over to Caroline for the first session of this webinar on labeling and packaging. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marco, and good afternoon, everybody. Greetings from a very frozen Midlands, and I hope you're all safe and not stuck in snow. For those of you who joined us last week, we looked at the reclassification and notification obligations under CLP. But today, we are going to look at the next step, once you have classified and notified your substances to the C&L inventory and ECHA, the next step in the C&L process is what we call the L, which is labeling, and the P, which is packaging. The hazard label, at the end of the day, is the most important element when it comes to hazard communication, as it is the first indicator of what hazards the chemical has and what the worker and the consumer have to look out for. It therefore needs to be very clear and unambiguous. For those of you who have delved into the CLP regulation already, you might have noticed that Title 3 is called Hazard Communication in the Form of Labeling. Now, this wording was deliberately chosen during the negotiations on CLP to clearly indicate that there is another very important hazard communication tool for the worker, namely the safety data sheet, which in European terms is regulated by REACH, but in the global context also sits under the UN GHS Purple Book, which is the basis of CLP. The idea behind this is to have one comprehensive global hazard communication system. Sinead will speak more about the SDSs following this presentation, but it's important to reiterate before we get started that from a regulatory, industrial and safety practitioner perspective, it's pretty much impossible to separate out the hazard label from the safety data sheet. So in practical terms, the two should always be considered for and planned for together. Now, before we get started, I just want to mention 4 interlinked acronyms, which you will hear throughout the presentations today. The first of these is CPL, and this stands for the Classification, Packaging and Labelling, and represents the existing classification and labelling regime which has been in place in Europe for over 40 years, via Directive 67548, better known as the DSD, and via Directive 9945, which is better known as the DPD. And these are implemented in Ireland through statutory instruments. The second acronym is GHS, and this stands for the Globally Harmonized System for Chemicals, and is the United Nations initiative which forms the basis of CLP, and whose aim is to have a global hazard communication system for all chemicals. The third acronym is CLP, and this stands for Classification, Labeling and Packaging of Substances and Mixtures. And this is the new EC regulation that gives effect to the United Nations GHS and gives these criteria and labeling rules a legal basis in Europe. The fourth acronym, Classification and Labeling, D&L, is the outcome of all 3 different regulatory regimes. Today, the focus of our attention is on CLP. But you will see they're all very much interconnected, and it is the reason why we're all here today, for hazard communication. Now, moving on to the presentation itself, firstly, I will outline briefly why we need CLP, how this was achieved, and who is responsible, particularly for the labelling and packaging aspects of CLP. And more importantly, when does this have to be done? Once I have established that, I will show you what the label elements are. I will review the challenges that the precaution statement assignment might bring to you, and certain aspects of CLP, such as Article 33, which is a new concept which has caused some interesting queries to our help desk. Then, like any good regulation, there's always exemptions and derogations from labelling and packaging, and I'll briefly outline what they are. And then the timeline for when you have to have a CLP compliant label. I will then give you just one example of a scenario which we've had into our CLP help desk quite a lot, which relates to the confusion with workplace science regulation. But firstly, I just want to take a quick step back as to why we needed a global hazard communication system in the first place. And this picture represents what I call the current state of play with respect to hazard communication around the world, and it's the fundamental reason why we needed to find a mechanism for communicating hazards of chemicals in the same way. These pictograms represent one chemical substance with the same intrinsic hazardous properties, yet you can clearly see the resultant hazard communication on the label is different. Hence, the problem is very clear to see. This problem has resulted in over 40 years of different regulatory regimes building up around the world. But we now live, as you all know, in a global village, and these differing hazard communication systems is causing difficulties for the global chemical industry and workers and consumers, not to mention the cost to industry trying to keep up with all the different regulatory regimes around the world. But we did find a solution, and here it is. The United Nations Globally Harmonized System. The purple book, as you can clearly see. This is what we call the solution, and after many years has now provided us with a common basis for classification and hazard communication for the supply and use of chemicals, regardless of where they're made or used around the globe. The GHS was agreed by the United Nations Committee of Experts of both the Transport of Dangerous Goods and the Globally Harmonized System. It was formally approved by the United Nations Economic and Social Council in 2003, after more than a decade of negotiations. It is updated continuously, every biennium, with the most recent one being in July 2009. But the work on the first edition is almost complete, and will be finalised next week at the 20th session of the United Nations Subcommittee of Experts in Geneva. The UN GHS system is very open and transparent, and if you would like further information, I would recommend that you click on the hyperlink off the slide when you receive the presentation after this event. However, GHS is an international convention, and as such is not legally binding in Europe. Therefore, we needed to find a mechanism to give it a legal basis, and we achieved this through CLP. Here comes the legal bit. So basically, we needed to find a legal basis for the GHS criteria, and we did this in Europe by a CLP. And this CLP is currently based on the second edition of the Purple Book, which was published in 2007. And we already are moving on to our second ATP, which will bring the third edition, the 2009 edition, into Europe. And you will also notice there was the first ATP published last year, and that was to allow for the existing legislation. The old Annex 1 had been repealed, and we needed to find a home for the 30th and 31st ATPs to the Dangerous Substances Directive, so therefore that was the reason for that. You will notice, however, that Annex 6 does not include the first ATP yet, so something to watch out for when you're searching for Annex 6 substances. In order to give the enforcement and administrative functions to CLP in Ireland, we needed to amend our Chemicals Act. And this is currently underway, and the ink is soon to be dried on that. The CLP regulation is direct acting in all European member states, but in order to have the administrative enforcement mechanisms, we needed to put it into place. In Ireland, there's two competent authorities: ourselves, the Health and Safety Authority, and the Pesticides Division of the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food. In addition to that, Bowman Hospital, which is under our Department of Health, will have responsibility for Article 45 relating to poison centres. These will be published shortly, and again you can see from the slide there's hyperlinks which will bring you to the draft regulations for both the Chemicals Act and the second ATP. Now, the CLP itself entered into force in Europe on the 20th of January 2009. It applies from the 1st of December, which was yesterday, for substances. But there are derogations available for substances which are already on the shelf, already placed on the market. This allows enterprises time to adapt to the new rules. Likewise, for mixtures, CLP will apply from the 1st of June 2015, and again there is a derogation for those mixtures that are already placed on the market. They can stay there until 2017. And again, this is allowing industry time to prepare to change from the existing system to the new system. So in effect, we will have a dual system for a number of years to come. It should be noted that CLP does allow mixtures to be classified from now, due to the derogation in Article 61. But that's not a legal requirement, but if you do have the information that you require for all your substances in accordance with CLP, you can go ahead and apply it to mixtures if you so wish. The placing on the market aspect of all of this has raised a lot of questions to the help desks, not only our own, but many around Europe. And this has resulted in a recently published FAQ, and I would recommend that you read that in order to get a clear picture of what it actually means in practice. The FAQs are available from the ECHO website. Now, moving on to the who has responsibility for CLP. Here you can clearly see, marked in red, that all the suppliers in the supply chain have a responsibility with respect to the labelling and packaging, in the compliance of labelling and packaging with regards to CLP. Unlike last week, where it was clear that only the manufacturer and importer had a responsibility for the classification and notification, everybody in the supply chain has a responsibility for labelling and packaging. If you are a downstream user or a distributor, you can take the classification from the manufacturer or importer further up the supply chain, so long as you do not change the composition of the mixture. But once you put your own name and address on the label, you have to take responsibility for the accuracy of the information, and you must satisfy yourself that it is correct. There are some derogations from packaging, including soluble packaging, which I'll expand upon later in the presentation. Now, what I'll do is move on to the label elements themselves. Now, here are the label elements listed in Article 17 of CLP, and as you can clearly see, the basic principles of labelling under CLP are the same as those from the existing system. What has changed is the pictograms and the terminology. So instead of risk and safety phrases, you have hazard and precaution statements. Instead of the orange symbols, you have now got the pictograms with the red border. What you will also see is supplemental information. Now, this is a new concept under CLP, and one I'll explain a little bit more about later. What you also have is nominal quantity, which is required for substances that are supplied to the general public. You will also note the official language requirement, and all member states require that any products placed on their market is in the official language. Now, moving on to the label itself, this is just a mock-up of the label to show you what all the different label elements will look like in the future. As you can see on the left-hand side, we have the product identifier. Now, this is something that has been improved upon from the existing system. And then you can see the hazard pictograms, the signal word. The signal word is again something new under CLP. In the old system, we would have had an indication of danger for each symbol, whereas that's no longer the case. I'll explain that a little bit further later on. You can see the supplier information and the hazard and precaution statements. And there's space left for supplemental information, which I'll expand upon later. The product identifier, as I said, is a very important element of CLP, and again, what I alluded to earlier about the safety data sheet and the label having to be considered together, that is because the product identifier for the substance or the mixture on the label must be the same as that used on the SDS. The product identifier of a substance must be either of the following, and as you can clearly see, these are listed from those that are in the harmonized CNL, Annex 6, those that are listed in the CNL inventory, those that have UTAC names, and those have other trade names. It is important that you only use the substance identity that can be clearly indicated on the product label. Again, for the mixture, the product identifier should be the trade name or the designation of the mixture. The identity of the substances that contribute to the classification of the mixture must also be included. Now, unlike the CPL system, the scope of including the name of the substance is much broader in that it's all the hazard classes and hazard categories have to be named if you're acute toxicity, skin corrosion, etc. No more than 4 names are required on the label unless it is needed to reflect the severity of the hazard. If you do not want the name listed on the product, there is a requirement to request an alternative name, which is another process which I won't go into today. There are precedence rules for the hazard pictogram under CLP, but they're somewhat limited, only allowing for the exclusion of the exclamation mark for certain hazard categories in comparison to the existing CPL system. In the existing CPL system, you would never have seen more than 3 danger symbols appearing on the label, whereas under the new CLP rules, you can have up to 5 or 6 pictograms for complex hazardous mixtures. This will, as we know, prove to be a challenge for those preparing the new CLP labels. The signal word, as I mentioned earlier, can be either danger or warning. Its use will depend on the classification of the mixture, and if you have danger, you will not use warning on the label. This is clear and unambiguous language, which I think, from a global communication perspective, is much better, particularly for the consumer, as it is more easily understood than the rules that we had used heretofore under CPL. The hazard statements, these replace the risk phrases that we would have been familiar with, and they're coded depending on the hazard class. So the 200 series is for the physical hazard, 300 for the health hazard, and the 400 for the environmental hazard. This is an improvement from both a user and a regulator perspective because it's very easy to pick up on the code depending on the endpoint. There are 70 hazard statements in total, but there is room for expansion, so not all of the 300 to say 399 series is filled up. But it's certainly been an improvement from a software perspective if you're trying to decipher the assignment of hazard statements in the future. Likewise, for precautionary statements, these have replaced the safety phrases, and again are now coded and arranged depending on their purpose, which again is an improvement on the coding that we would have had in the past. What is going to be a challenge in the future, which I'll mention shortly, is the fact that there's double the amount of precautionary statements than we would have had safety phrases, and also there's no requirement for there's no obligatory precautionary statements, unlike what we had in the previous system. So we do realize there's a challenge ahead, but I'll talk you through the solution we have in a few moments. Moving on to supplemental information. This is again, as I said earlier, is a new concept under CLP, and it allows us to incorporate into CLP what we call our EU leftovers. This was allowed because of the United Nations building block approach, where they were allowed to keep what we had built up over the years, as opposed to starting from scratch and having to throw the baby out with the bathwater. This was a good thing because we had an awful lot of things that are not yet in the UNGHS and may not be for some time to come. These new codes are distinguished from the H statements by the EU to make it clear that they only apply within the EU. We have, over the process of developing the labelling and packaging guidance, we have divided them into what we call obligatory supplemental information and non-obligatory supplemental information. And it's also important to note that these only apply within the EU and the EEA countries only, as they're not part of the global UNGHS system. Looking firstly at the obligatory supplemental information, again, these came from an existing CPL. The obligatory system is easily recognized because of the codes that they have been given. And if you look at EUH001, that is like a hazard, what we now call a hazard property, and it would be R1 under the existing scheme. Likewise, EUH059 is R59 under the existing scheme. Just on a note for R59, which is ozone layer, that it is now being superseded, if you like, by the HAT Statement 420, which will be introduced for the second ATT to CLP. In addition to the hazardous properties, we also have another set of codes. The one I've shown you here is EUH201. Now, these came from the special labelling provisions that came from the DPD, the Dangerous Preparations Directive. We have improved them along the way in that we now have given them a code, and in some cases have improved the text so it made more sense. Some of them would have said, contact the manufacturer for more information, whereas now we explicitly say what the concern is. In addition to what we had in the existing system, there are other community laws that require obligatory information on the label. The one I show you here is EUH401, which is for plant protection products. So it is required specifically for that. And in addition, even though they do not have an EUH code, it will in the future, the authorization number under REACH will require to be put on the label. So that is another obligatory piece of supplemental information that does not have an EUH code. This information has to be placed alongside the other label elements set out in Article 17. Moving on to the non-obligatory information, and really this is anything other than that's obligatory. So it can be it could be instructions for use, it could be specific information on the product itself, and the content is really up to the supplier. It may be placed alongside the other labeling elements. There's no obligation to have it that way, and it's very critically important that it does not distract or contradict obligatory labeling elements. For instance, if it's something that's oxidizing, you have to make sure the instructions for use do not contradict that hazard. These are easily recognized from a labeling author perspective in that they do not have an EUH code, so their inclusion in the label is optional. Again, having gone through all the label elements, I just wanted to show you this label again, just to go through all the different label elements. And really, as you can see, there's nothing, the output from the changes to CLP are not that apparent to the user. Other than pictogram and the indication of danger, everything else will stay the same. One thing I did want to mention today is the cautionary statement assignment, and the reason for this is because of the doubling of the precautionary statements to what we would have had in the past. There are very limited conditions of use at the moment, and it is causing a real challenge to fit all the labels and precautionary statements onto the label, or even decide what is clearly redundant. And because CLP requires no more than 6 key statements on the label. So we have come up with a proposal, and it's under the HSA Guidance. And here we have developed what we call a traffic light system. And the traffic light system is based on what we would have had in the past for the conditions of use for the assignment of safety phrases. What is different here is that they're not obligatory, but it just gives a feel for what we would have been used to in the past. So we have highly recommended, recommended, and optional. And then these are subdivided then depending on whether it's a professional user who will always have access to the safety data sheet versus the general public who don't have access to the safety data sheet. This guidance has currently undergone public consultation. It is available on the ECHO website. You can see again the hyperlink there. You can look at it afterwards. And it is expected to be published in the spring of 2011. Now, it is pretty much finalised. It's just that ECHA put a moratorium on all publications because of the pressure of the other deadlines for both REACH and CLP. Then there's the general labelling rules, and these might be what one would call stating the obvious, but again, we have them in the existing system, so we put them into the CLP system, and I don't think it's any harm, particularly from a regulatory perspective, and to know where you stand, what's acceptable and what is not. It's pretty much common sense, but the label has to be firmly affixed onto the packaging, has to be set down horizontally, you have to be able to clearly read it, and we also brought over from the existing system the requirements, the dimension requirements that we had in the past. And this is just really, again, to make sure that the information that is put together on a label is within certain dimensions and that the pictograms can be clearly seen. A bit of common sense, really, is all it is. This slide just gives you an indication of the challenges that you're going to face as the producer of a label in the future. As you can clearly see, the increase in information that would be required. In the old system, we wouldn't have had as many pictograms or as many safety phrases as we will have now under CLP. And again, this is just to make you aware that the challenges that we face going forward with the new CLP system. So although it has huge advantages in that we will all be looking at the same pictograms and the same terms and the same formats, the orientation of labelling, the size of labelling, and the concerns that people have for that, and rightly have to be considered both from an application perspective and from a regulatory perspective. Article 33 is one I just want to touch upon because, again, it is a new concept that came about in the CLP negotiations. And although transport is outside the scope of CLP, one element where it is included is in Article 33. And what Article 33 does is it sets out specific rules for labelling of outer, inner and single packaging. And the idea behind this really was to simplify the label. So basically, if you have a hazard pictogram for both supply and transport on a single package, then you'll only use one of them. And transport takes precedence, so therefore you'd only use the transport pictogram on the outer package. Outer packaging does not need to be labelled at all if you can clearly see the inner package. Again, this is perhaps stating the obvious, but it is now set out in Article 33 to make life simpler for those who have to deal with inner, outer and single packaging. This is just an example of what Article 33 might present in the future, and it is a model that emanated from the UNGHS and one which I think will catch on in the future. The image I find this being used in primarily would be in, say, 200-litre drums, whereas historically you would have had the transport label on one side and the supply label on the other, whereas now you have the opportunity to combine both the transport rules and the supply rules in a situation where you have a pictogram for transport. You do not need to repeat it for supply. I just noticed the pictogram for the dead fish and treat is missing a border, but apologies for that. And then, like any good labelling and packaging rules, there are the exemptions. And the exemptions from L&T, again, came from the existing system where we allowed certain derogations from the content of the label, depending on if it was small. What we have done under CLP, however, is to expand that and to recognise that there's new technologies out there and new needs, especially for multi-language labels. So you can now use a fold-out label, tie-on label on the outer packaging. It has to be acknowledged that this is a challenge and will be a challenge for those who have to administer it, but I think it's good that it has been included. We also have the exemptions for dropping, if you like, certain hazard statements or precaution statements for packages that are less than 125 millilitres. And again, that came from the existing system and something that we found useful in the past, so we brought it with us into the future. This is just an example of a small label. Again, it's just to show you the ingenuity that industry will have to come up with in order to fit the amount of pictograms that are required onto the package. In this instance, a number of the cost year statements can be admitted due to the exemptions allowed under CLP. There's a number of new provisions in CLP that weren't in the existing system, and these are soluble packaging for single use. Again, this is to acknowledge the new technologies have developed over the years, and to try and address the concerns, particularly say from the detergent industry, whereby they were having to put labels on soluble packaging, which would then end up in the wood system. Likewise, the concerns were raised over negotiations about supplying ready-mix cement to the general public without packaging, which is quite common. But now if you do that, you have to deliver with the wet cement the labelling elements. How you do that is up to yourself, but it is a new requirement whereby the general public is allowed to have the label elements even if it is delivered without packaging. This is now currently only for cement, but this article can be expanded if other concerns arise in the future. The derogations from labelling again came from the existing CPL system for transport cylinders, gas, propane, aerosols, metals in a massive form, and explosives. These were not changed during the negotiation process, but simply lifted from the existing system into CLP. What we do have under CLP is a new requirement to update the label, and this is important because it's something that was missing in the past, and something we realised we needed for the future, again to keep it consistent with safety data sheets. So now, if you have a more severe hazard, if something's going from irritant to corrosive, you have to change the label without undue delay. Now, undue delay isn't defined by time period, but it is defined by urgency, so one would assume that it's as soon as practicable. Other changes, say like telephone number, product name, whatever, can be done within 18 months. It should also be noted that the plant protection products and biocides have their own updating requirements by their own directives, so they are excluded from this requirement under CLP. Packaging is something that's not in GHS as such, but again it came from the existing system, and for the most part, especially at a global level, if a package meets the requirements for transport, it is deemed to meet the requirements of supply and use. What we have in addition in Europe is something we've built up over many years, is the child-resistant fastenings and tactile warnings of danger for the general public. It's also worth noting that these apply only within the EU, EEA countries, but it's important that they go over and above the fastening requirements for products to meet the transport provisions. These are in addition, and are required only for certain hazard classes, again, which mirror those that existed in the existing CPL system, was simply carried over to CLP. And this is one that I just wanted to bring your attention to, and it is a question, it's probably one of our most frequently asked questions to our own national help desk, and that is a concern over which pictogram do you use and when. And this emanates primarily for the workplace warning sign that you see here as the triangle. And over many queries, a lot of people seem to think that they now have to change their warning symbol under the workplace signs to the GHS pictogram. But just to be clear, that they come from the workplace signs regulations, which is a European directive 9258 EC, and it's transposed in Ireland through a general applications regulation. So therefore, in the context of CLP, it is considered a piece of downstream legislation, so the pictograms will not change until such time as the parent directive in Europe is amended to update the CLP requirements. We do appreciate that there is also an exclamation mark in the workplace signs regulations, and there's also a St. Andrew's cross. So we do realise that these will have to be updated in the future, but for now, for those of you who have concerns, the workplace signs regulations remain as is. You will also see the transport pictogram, and just alluding back to what we discussed earlier in Article 33, you will not see the GHS pictogram, and a transport pictogram together on the outer packaging. You will only see the transport pictogram. And you will never see the orange symbol from CPL together with the triangle from CLP. You can only have one or the other. So at the end of the day, you should only have one out of the four. They are currently running under 4 different regulatory regimes, and where you might require the workplace sign for transient chemicals in the workplace, the others have to be decided on a case-by-case basis depending on where the need is. And also to reiterate the fact that the workplace signs regulations is a risk-based approach, whereas what we deal with here is hazard communication and not risk communication. Just to conclude, some preparation tips really to make sure that you know, you need to know where you are in the supply chain. You need to know what your roles and obligations are. You need to confirm what substances and mixtures you have. You need to clearly identify them. You need to compile an inventory so you know what you have. You need to make sure that are there any exemptions apply? Are the supplier details correct? You need to apply the labeling element of the pictogram, the signal word, the head of the caution statement, and supplemental elements. There is a systematic process that you need to go through to make sure that you have the label correct. You need to make sure it's the right size and the right dimension, and most importantly, you need to make sure that it's consistent with the safety data sheet. You need to be prepared and you need to be organized. And luckily, help is at hand. We do have a CLP help desk, and it has a local number, an email, and a dedicated web page. We do have posters that can be printed at both A1 and A4 size, and we have a brochure. ECHA have a huge amount of guidance documents. It's unprecedented in the history of chemical legislation. I have to say the FAQs that were published last week are excellent, and a huge body of teamwork of experts from around Europe. And I'd certainly recommend for those of you who are responsible for labelling and packaging only that you at least read the FAQs, the introductory guidance, and the labelling and packaging draft. I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and I will pass you now over to my colleague Sinead, who will outline the new requirements for the safety data sheet.
Many thanks, Caroline, and good afternoon. Well, this afternoon I'm going to set out the new requirements for safety data sheets as laid down by the new Regulation 453 of 2010. So the key points that I want to get across today are the reasons for the new legislation governing safety data sheets in the EU, what changes this new legislation will bring into place in the content of the SDS and who will have to comply with it, the timelines for implementing these changes, and when to update your safety data sheet if you're responsible for preparing them, and when you can expect to see the changes if you receive safety data sheets. I'll also try to give you some information on where you can find further guidance at the end of this presentation. So an amendment to REACH was required, and this came into place through Commission Regulation EU number 453 of 2010, and this addresses the changes in the requirements for safety data sheets. And just to give you a little background on the reasons why this was necessary, as Caroline has already mentioned, the label and the safety data sheet are very closely linked, and they provide the user or ourselves with information on the classification of chemicals, the hazards and risks associated with the chemical, and how to control those risks. So the safety data sheet needed to be brought into line with the CLP regulation in the EU, and as the CLP regulation sets out the rules for labelling, and it also needed to be brought into line with the globally harmonised system, GHS, so that we could align ourselves with the rest of the world. And firstly, the changes to the EU SDS must be correlated with the CLP regulation. So Article 57 of CLP refers to and demands Article 31 of REACH concerning safety data sheets. And these changes relate to the wording, for example, preparations to mixtures, etc., and the transitional arrangements for classification and labelling of substances and mixtures. The REACH regulation then needed to be amended to include the requirements as set out under CLP, and as I said, we needed to align ourselves with GHS. So Annex 4 of the Purple Book is entitled Guidance on the Preparation of Safety Data Sheets, and this is used as the basis for the new legislation 453/2010, along with some certain EU-specific needs that we had ourselves. So when did this come into force? Well, it came into force on the 20th of June 2010, but as and from yesterday, the 1st of December 2010, Annex 1 of 453 replaces Annex 2 of REACH as we know it. And as I said, this is to bring in the changes to the SDS to reflect GHS, and most importantly, to bring the SDS into line with CLP with regards to the classification of substances. So Section 2 of the SDS will now have a dual classification system until June 2015, and it will hold the CLP classification of the substance as well as the CPL, so the Dangerous Substance Directive classification of the substance. The label will be to CLP only, and as I said, this will go on until June 2015. There are certain derogations in place, and I will go through those a little later on. Then from the 1st of June 2015, Annex 2 of 453 will replace Annex 1 of 453 and allow for the changes CLP will make to the classification of mixtures to be addressed in the safety data sheet. So from that date on, all substances and all mixtures will be to CLP in Section 2 of the SDS and on the label, unless specific derogations apply. This slide here, I just wanted to show you that the format that we know is not changing. So we will still have the 16 headings as we know them, as they're set out in Article 31 of the REACH regulation. However, what you will see are a lot more subsections under each section. And I think at last count I counted up 48. So there's no changes in the format itself, as in the layout of the headings, but there will be a lot more information required. So the first change that you're likely to see is that the regulation changes the text of Annex 2 from a guide to the compilation of safety data sheets in the title to requirements for the compilation of safety data sheets. And I think this indicates that this is what you should be doing, i.e. it's a requirement rather than this is what you could do, as in guiding you to what you should do. And I've set out over the next few slides the major changes that you will see coming into place in your safety data sheet over the next few years. I'm only going to go through what is new rather than reiterate what we already know is there in Annex 2 of REACH. So these are the new requirements as set out by 453 of 2010. Firstly, in Section 1, which deals with the identification of the substance or mixture and the identification of the company or undertaking, from the 1st of December this year for substances, you are required to provide a product identifier for a substance in Section 1, and this is in line with Article 18.2 of CLP and as provided on the label. Caroline has already gone through this with you, but I just reiterate a few facts again. So you have to give the same product identifier as you give in your registration dossier. So if your substance is in Annex 6, it's agreed or harmonised classification, then you give the name and identification number from there. If it's not in Annex 6, but it is in the C&L inventory, you give the name and identification from that inventory. If it's in neither of those, you give the CAS and the UPAC name or the international name. And if you don't have a CAS name, then you give the UPAC or the international name of the substance. For mixtures from the 1st of December up until the 1st of June 2015, you have to give the trade name or the designation as laid out in Directive 99/45 or the Dangerous Preparations Directive, if you are not applying CLP early to your mixture. And then from the 1st of June 2015, or according to Annex 2 of 453, for substances, as I've just said, you give the product identifier as in Article 18.2 of CLP, and you give the product identifier for a mixture according to Article 18.3 of CLP. So with this, you will need to give both of the following: the trade name or the designation of the mixture, and the identification of all substances in the mixture that contribute to its classification. And Caroline gave you the list earlier on with acute tox, skin corrosion, etc. And she also told you that a max of 4 chemical names will suffice, unless you need to put more on to indicate the severity of hazard. Now, the second big change you will see in Section 1 is the registration number, if it's applicable. And the registration number will be here in Section 1.1, and the last 4 digits referring to the individual registrant can be omitted from the registration number are either a downstream user or a distributor, but only if they can provide the full number on request from an authority. If they can't do it, then they forward the request to their supplier, and that supplier provides the authority with the full number within 7 days of the request. So just important to reiterate again, the last 4 digits can be omitted only by the downstream user or the distributor in this case, and not by a manufacturer or an importer. The other big change in Section 1 is uses advised against are included here, as well as uses of the chemicals. So which uses the supplier advises against and why has to be given here. It doesn't need to be an exhaustive list, but for example, you could say do not use for spraying, do not use for injecting, etc. And then the fourth change here would be details of the supplier of the SDS now includes the only representative in the list, so you can get the only representative contact details. If you're doing this, you may also get the details of the non-EU manufacturer or formulator, if you wish, where an OR has been appointed. The email address of the competent person and the emergency telephone number has to be in this section as well, as always was the case. Moving on to Section 2, which deals with hazard identification. I think this is where everybody's going to see the biggest change. You'll see all the classification and labelling information on substances and mixtures in this section now. So for substances, the existing CPL, or according to the Dangerous Substance Directive, and the new CLP classifications must appear in parallel from the 1st of December 2010 to the 1st of June 2015 in Section 2.1. The label elements must appear in Section 2.2, and the label must be to CLP, as Caroline has already indicated. So I've done a mock-up here of Section 2 for a safety data sheet for a substance. And as you can see, I've put in the classification according to CLP, I've put in the classification according to the Dangerous Substance Directive, so our existing CPL regs. And then in Section 2.2, I've put in all my label elements. And these are to CLP only, as is required on the label for my substance at present. So I've put in the hazard pictograms. They do not need to be in colour. They can be a black and white graphical, graphics, sorry. I put in the signal word, the hazard statements, and the precautionary statements. Now, you do not need to put in the code itself. For example, I put in H225 here, because this is not a legal requirement on the label. You're only required to put in the wording of the actual hazard statement. And this is just to illustrate what that label would look like to go along with the SDS I've just showed you. So Section 2 then, for mixtures, what will this look like from the 1st of December 2010 to the 1st of June 2015? Well, you'll have to have the existing CPL, or Dangerous Preparations Directive classification, in Section 2.1, and you'll have to have the label elements in Section 2.2, and they are to the Dangerous Preparations Directive. So, just to show you then what this will look like. Sorry. Okay. Sorry, my slide seems to have stuck. I just moved it on. Apologies. Now I've got it back again. Okay, so this is my mock-up for my safety data sheet for mixtures, and as you can see, I have my classifications according to the Dangerous Preparation Directive, and I have my label elements again according to, they are on the label to the Dangerous Preparations Directive. And again, I've done a mock-up of what that label would look like that goes along with that safety data sheet that I just showed you. So there are more changes to come in Section 2, and the biggest one here is that if you have a substance that's subject to authorization, the authorization must be included in Section 2.2 label elements. And this is because Article 65 of REACH says the authorization must appear on the label, and it states in Regulation 453 that the applicable label elements provided by other community legislation shall be placed in the section for supplemental information on your label as referred to in Articles 25 and 32.6 of CLP. You also have to place in subsection 2.3 information on whether the substance or the mixture meets the criteria for PBTs or BPVEs for the environment, so persistent, bioaccumulative, or toxic, or very persistent, or very bioaccumulative for the environment. Section 3 then, again, this is another section that has been changed quite a lot. It deals with the composition information on ingredients, and there is a reference to nanotechnology here in that you can provide appropriate and available safety information on surface chemistry. Now, I want to point out here that this is the only place in the safety data sheet that you're allowed to leave a subsection completely blank, as you either provide information on the substance in section 3.1 or for a mixture in section 3.2, so you're doing one or the other. In section 3.1, you provide the product identifier for the substance or the other ID that you have for it, and you also have to provide any chemical identity of any classified impurity or additive, etc., that contributes to the classification of the substance. And in doing that, you have to include the product identifier for that impurity. There's also a space here in the section for providing information on multi-constituent substances, if that's applicable to you. More changes in section 3. You have to provide the information on the mixtures in subsection 3.2. You have to provide a product identifier for all hazardous substances listed in section 3. Now, there is an option. You can list all substances in the mixture, whether they're hazardous or not, but that's completely up to you. You must list the hazardous substances, however. And this section is quite prescriptive now in that they ask for a concentration of substances in mixture described as exact percentages in descending order by mass or volume, or ranges of percentages in descending order by mass or volume if technically possible. Before, this wasn't an actual requirement. They did say that you could give a full composition, though a general description of components and concentrations would be helpful. So it wasn't an actual requirement as such. Also in section 3, for substances listed, you have to provide the classification according to CPL, so the Dangerous Substance Directive. So you have to give an indication of danger, you have to give the symbol letter, and you have to give the OR phrases. However, if CPL classification is made available to you by a supplier, or if it is available publicly on Annex 6, then you have to give that CLP classification in addition to the CPL classification. So you would have to provide hazard class, category code, hazard statement. And here as well, you have to provide a registration number for substances listed in section 3 where available. Now, in this case, the last 4 digits, again, can be omitted by the supplier, and in this case, whether the supplier is a manufacturer, importer, downstream user, or distributor. So by all suppliers. We move on then to sections 4, 5, and 6. And I put in a little note at the bottom of this slide to say subsections. And this is just to remind you that there are a lot more subsections here required here, a lot more detail, and the quality of information should be much better than we have previously seen. So under section 4, which deals with first aid measures, for example, there's a requirement to provide advice on whether PPE is required for the first aider and what that PPE would be. In section 5, which deals with firefighting measures, again more specific advice is to be provided. Examples, specific advice for firefighters, such as keep containers cool with spray water. Section 6, which deals with accidental measures, appropriate advice on containment and cleanup of spills is required. So we're not looking for generic information anymore, and I think as information from registration dossiers and chemical safety reports and exposure scenarios come through, and this information is added to the safety data sheet, we're going to see an increase in the quality of information we receive, and that can only be a good thing. So we're just urging you to fill out all the subsections and don't leave any blank, and certainly don't put in generic statements. Under section 7 then, we have a lot of changes. You should emphasize the precautions that are appropriate to identify uses referred to in section 1.2 of the safety data sheet and the unique properties of the chemicals. More specifics are required. I've given a few examples here, such as precautions for safe handling, conditions for safe storage, any incompatibilities, and this should reflect what would be under section 10 for stability and reactivity, and then specific end uses. Section 8 then. Section 8 deals with exposure controls and personal protection. And you have to list all national OELVs and national biological limits for member states where the safety data sheet has been provided. This is extremely important that you ensure that you have the OELV for the member state where that SDS is going to be supplied. You can give information on control banding approach. This is not mandatory. It's something that you may do, and it's according to the International Label Organization complementary approach, because it's not possible to assign OELs to every chemical. Also, more specifics are required, and an example of this would be where you have materials that are posing thermal hazards, and special consideration needs to be given in this case for the construction of the PPE used and what type of PPE that would be. DNLs for human health and DNECs for the environment must also be provided in Section 8, but this was always the case as under our Annex 2 under the REACH regulation. Section 9 then, greater reference is given here to nanotechnology, and I've listed out what you are expected to put in if dealing with such materials. So under 9.1, under appearance, you're give information on appropriate and available safety information on granulometry and specific surface area, and under 9.2, appropriate and available safety info on redox potential, radical formation potential, and photocatalytic properties. Section 9 also brings in some new changes under 453. We always had the property odour there, and you could list whether it was perceptible or what the smell was, etc. But now you also have the additional property of odour threshold. There are also the ones of melting point, freezing point, upper and lower flammability or explosive limits, auto-ignition temperature, decomposition temperature, and they merge solubility and water solubility as one heading solubilities. Another important point to get across here is that if the property doesn't apply, you must state why. So list all the properties and then beside them give values or results, and if you don't have any to put beside it, then state why this is the case, i.e. that you couldn't physically test the product due to whatever its state. Section 10 then, again we have more detailed information on the specific subsections which I've listed here, such as reactivity, conditions to avoid, incompatible materials, etc. Section 11 is quite detailed. From the 1st of December for substances and the 1st of June 2015 for mixtures, the information on specific target organ toxicity, both single and repeated exposure, is required. Information on all hazard classes has to be given. If you don't provide information, then you must tell us why. It's due to lack of data, a technical impossibility in obtaining the data, inconclusive data, or conclusive data but insufficient for classification. And in this latter case, you have to state on the SDS, based on available data, classification criteria are not met. And you have to give relevant supportive info to back that up. Also, brief summaries and reference to test methods are required, and summarised evaluation of CMR properties. So the info is very detailed, should be laid out very clearly for different endpoints. In relation to mixtures, for information that relates to the mixture as a whole, or whether the information relates to the substances within the mixture, should be very, very clearly laid out. Section 12, then, again, it's so much more detailed. For ecological information, you have to give results of PBT and PVB assessments. Section 13, dealing with disposal considerations. In addition to recommendations on disposal, you have to give waste treatment methods. And in Section 14 on transport information, you give the information as before, but with additional information required, for example, special precautions for the user or transport for in bulk info. Section 15, again, another big change. No more label information is required here. It will all go into Section 2, as I showed you earlier on. But here you put in regulatory info that's not included elsewhere in the SDS. Example would be national laws on young or pregnant workers, water framework directive, or as I have here, export-import regulations, the basal categories under the COMA regs, etc. If an authorization has been granted or refused, you must state it here. If a restriction has been imposed, you can give it here. And if a chemical safety assessment has been carried out, state it here. Section 16, for other information, As before, you give revision details, references, training details, list the all phrases, list the hazard statements. But what is new is dealing with mixtures, you must give the details of the methods for evaluating the info as laid out under Article 9. So did you use bridging principles, did you use a calculation method, etc. And if a mixture supplier chooses to identify and inform of CLP classification without labelling according to CLP, he includes the classification here in this section. So this is for voluntary early application of CLP and to make people aware of what that CLP classification would be for your mixture. Now this one is just a reiteration of what I've already said before, just to remind you of the timelines. So the first part came in yesterday and replaced Annex 2 of REACH yesterday and aligns us with the CNL requirements for substances. And the second part, effective from the 1st of June 2015 and aligns with the CNL requirements for mixtures and also provides for substances after the end of the transitional period. A few musts. From the 1st of December 2010, all suppliers of substances and mixtures must provide SDSs according to Annex 1 of 453. And from the 1st of June 2015, all suppliers must provide safety data sheets according to Annex 2 of 453. A few don't need to yet, so a few derogations. As Caroline has mentioned, substances on the market before the 1st of December 2010, the SDS does not need to be aligned to Annex 1 of 453 until the 1st of December 2012, similarly for label and packaging. Mixtures on the market before the 1st of June 2015, again the SDS does not need to be aligned to Annex 2 of 453, similar to the label and packaging rules, until the 1st of June 2017. And an additional derogation here, suppliers of mixtures who provided an SDS to customers before the 1st of December 2010, you don't need to align your SDS to Annex 1 of 453 until the 30th of November 2012. However, as a supplier of a mixture, you can apply Annex 2 before the 1st of June, but you must provide the classification of the mixture according to CPL and CLP in Section 2, and your label therefore must be to CLP. You must provide classification of substances in the mixture in Section 3 according to both CPL and CLP. Or, as I stated before, between the 1st of December and the 1st of June 2015, you may choose to identify the CLP classification only by adding it into Section 16. So when to update? Well, for substance and mixture placed on the market from the 1st of December, you update your SDS according to Annex 1 now. Derogations are in place for those already on the market, but don't apply if an update is required by Article 31.9 of REACH. And Article 31.9 of REACH, just to remind you that it says you should update your safety data sheet without delay on the following occasions: if you have new information affecting risk management measures, or if new information on hazards become available, if you have an authorization granted or refused, or restriction has been imposed. So, for substances already on the market, if the SDS needs updating at any time after 30th of November 2010, according to Article 31.9, it needs to be aligned with the new annex, even before the 1st of December 2012. And similarly for mixtures, if it needs updating according to Article 139 for whatever reason, for example, an authorization was granted, it needs to be aligned with the relevant version of 453 before the 1st of June 2015. So remember, CLP derogations apply, as Caroline explained to you before. If the label is to CLP, then the CLP classification must be in Section 2 of the SDS, and there must be dual classification between now and the 1st of June 2015. And then just a few general rules that we've always had, but consistency between sections is vital. Consistency with exposure scenarios, our chemical safety reports and registration dossiers is very important. All sections are mandatory, we don't want any blanks, and no generic statements. So there's just a summary of what I've said. So for substances, you have CLP and info in the SDS from the 1st of December, with transition possible to the 1st of December 2012. For mixtures, CLP info up until the 1st of June 2015 was the 1st of June 2015 with possible transition to the 1st of June 2017. No transition for substance or mixtures with respect to SDSs if any of the conditions in Article 31.9 apply, and early implementation is allowed for mixtures under certain conditions. So we have guidance on help. You can go to our publications page on hsa.ie and download our information sheet. The second draft of the guidance on compilation of SDSs is underway. We're commenting on it at present, and we hope to have it finalised by next year. And you can always contact our Reach Helpdesk at reachright@HSA. So thank you, and I'd now like to hand back to Marco, our moderator.
Thank you, Sinead, and thank you, Caroline. We're running out of time, but we have received quite a few questions from all of you, and some of them are very technical. Therefore, we'll answer to you directly via email tomorrow or early next week. However, there's one general question that we currently receive in our help desk, and it has been submitted as well today by a few participants. Therefore, I would like to hand over to Caroline to answer this general question that we feel it's really needed an answer to clarify the issue. Caroline?
Thank you, Marco. The question relates to the use of blank pictograms on the label. And this is something that we would have had historically, and a concern that has been brought to the Helpdesk attention on a number of occasions. And that is basically, are empty diamonds or blank diamonds acceptable? Now, from a records perspective, it's something that we would advise against, but we also understand that an awful lot of labels are pre-printed en masse because a lot of companies, particularly SMEs, do not have thermal printing capacity. So therefore, we do advise that if there is a need to have perhaps mass printing with 3 pictograms, and then you have a product range with 2 pictograms, that you do black out the third pictogram, which is not required in that particular instance. Again, from an enforcement perspective, it's up to each member state to determine whether they consider the information is going to contradict or cast doubt on the validity of the rest of the information on the label. Article 25.3 quite clearly indicates that the mandatory label element must be clear, and that any supplemental information or any changes to the label must not cast out on the list that's been provided. So just bear that in mind. I would recommend that you review the CLP FAQs that were published last week, and in this instance particularly number 5.7, which is a new FAQ addressing this matter. Another one, which again we were asked about today, which is concerned about having items in stock and do you have to relabel them before you move them on. Again, this has been addressed in the FAQs, whereby if you already have a contract in place with the person who you're selling them on to and it's still in your warehouse, then you do not have to relabel. Again, I would suggest that you read FAQ 5.1, which addresses this matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. So just before closing, a few remarks before closing the event. On behalf of the CLP Helpdesk, I would like to thank all of you for attending this webinar. We hope you found it useful and that this will improve your job performances. The slides of today's presentation will be available as of Monday morning from the CLP section on our website. We will send you an email with a reminder and the hyperlink. There you can already find the slides from last week's event on the classification and notification of chemicals. Please know that early next week we will also make available the link to watch in streaming the recording of both the events. Any questions that we couldn't answer today will be answered directly to you via email early next week as well. Should you have further questions, please do not hesitate to contact the CLP Helpdesk using our email address or the phone number displayed here. If you also wish to find more information, please visit our website at the below links. Finally, when the event will close and we will leave the webinar console, a new window containing the feedback form to this webinar will pop up on your screen. This will take only 5 minutes to fill in, and we would really appreciate if you could complete it as your feedback is really vital for us to improve our service and provide you with always more efficient and satisfactory events in the future. I would like to therefore thank you again for your attention and to wish a good day to all of you.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your participation. You may now disconnect.